So this portion of the lecture will introduce us to will introduce you to Chaucer and the study of Chaucer, and should help supplement your own independent study of Chaucer. And so I want you to take a look at the period of studies timeline, um, so that we can kind of see what's going on. Um, you know, Chaucer is born in around 1340. He is 7 years old when the Black Death or the bubonic plague reaches its height in Europe. He survives, which is incredible. During this time in his life, during the last 25 years of his life at any rate, that is when London really starts to flourish as its own literary culture without France per se at the top of that. Chaucer lives for a very long time by medieval or Middle Ages standards. He is, he dies at 60 years old, which sounds very young by today's standards. Well, young for me, because the older I get, the younger 60 sounds. Young sounds 60 sounds young to me. At any rate, but remember, the average life expectancy is 37 during this time period. So he is probably considered a very ancient man at that time, because most people died in their 30s. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of the context of where we are in terms of the time. Okay. So Chaucer. Oh, what? Went too fast. I'm getting a little crazy here. So before that, we've talked about how English was, having this heavily French influence, and during Chaucer's time, Middle English develops, and this is where we see that resurgence of that old language pre-Norman invasion, meeting up with that French Norman invasion language and creating what scholars called Middle English. And that is what Chaucer writes in. He doesn't write in Old English. He doesn't write in Elizabethan English like Shakespeare. He writes in Middle English. So if I were to ask you if Chaucer writes in blank English, you would fill in that blank with Middle English, not Old English, because they're two different things. Middle English is the language of the everyday people during this time period. And Chaucer is considered the father of our modern language because he writes in the vernacular, the everyday language of the people. He brings English back, okay? In the 14th century, during Chaucer's time, there are a lot of political and social changes. And there's even like huge nature changes as well. You have the bubonic plague or the Black Death during this time. 35% of England's population died in 1348 alone. It's estimated that about 50% of the population in Europe and Asia died during the period of the bubonic plague. Now, those are estimates. We don't know if those numbers are high or lower than they should be, but we do know that a lot of people died. And if you're talking about 50%, that's, you have two kids, one's going to die, 1 and 2. There's also some political power struggles between monarchy and barons. I don't really want us to get caught up in all of that because this isn't a history course. And when we get to Mallory's section and we move into the second book, I will have to get into some of the details with the monarchy because the War of the Roses happens and it's this huge issue. And so for now, we'll just say there's some underlying things bubbling in the monarchy with who's in charge between the monarchy and the aristocracy, the lords and barons of the land. And then the aristocracy is also getting pressures economically from merchants and peasants to be able to have ownership in their own, wares and finances. So, I mean, I think as a person that very much likes capitalism personally, I think that that's a good thing, but the aristocracy probably at the time did not think this was such a good thing. Okay. The church has its share of issues too. There's corruption with the selling of indulgences and doctrine disputes that we'll talk about even more when we get into the Reformation. And there's also those slight beginnings of that mercantile class that I'd mentioned before, and they are not belonging to the peasant class anymore. They're really beginning to earn their own money and land, and they're creating this new culture of patrons and consumers. And even the peasants are beginning to fight for their own rights. There were a series of revolts during this time. So huge changes politically, huge changes societally, and huge natural circumstances that happens. And we'll see more about those peasant voices in Chaucer's character, the wife of Bath, and we'll also see some of those critiques on the church and the aristocracy in the Nun's Priest's Tale, as well as Alison's Tale, the wife of Bath. So this is a picture of Geoffrey Chaucer. He looks very portly. That's a nice way of saying fat. Could just be his robes. And so I found this background video for you guys on Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. And it's about 11 minutes, but I do think it's worth it. I think this lady does an excellent job giving you a history of Chaucer's Chaucer's background, and also a little bit of background about the tales themselves. So let's watch this for a second, or 11 minutes actually. Whoop, clicked on the wrong thing. So we can get some more info. And of course, I will link to these separately in our D2L course shell if you want to look at them later.
Geoffrey Chaucer, renowned before Shakespeare, is considered the first finder of our English language. His Canterbury Tales ranks as one of the greatest public works in English literature. Renowned author, Chaucer also contributed importantly to the second half of the 14th century to the management of public affairs as a courtier, diplomat, and civil servant. In a career that spanned 3 successive kings, Chaucer was praised and trusted. But it is his avocation, the writing of poetry, for which he is remembered. Geoffrey Chaucer was born around 1342, likely in London. His family name derives from the French Chaucieux, meaning shoemaker, though Chaucer's father was a wine merchant. Chaucer's first appearance in historic records is in 1357 as a member of the household of Elizabeth, Countess of Ulster, wife of Lionel, third son of King Edward III. Geoffrey's father presumably had been able to place him among a group of young men and women serving in that royal household, a customary arrangement whereby families who could provide their children with opportunity necessary for courtly education and connections to advance their careers, especially since Chaucer reportedly had 16 siblings. This was going to excel him in society. Though this meant Chaucer had to leave his family and work as a page in servant to a knight, he was only 15 years old. By age 17, Chaucer was a member of King Edward III's army in France and was even captured during the unsuccessful siege of Reims. The king himself contributed to Chaucer's ransom to save him in order to return him to his Majesty's service. Chaucer surfaced again in historic record on February 22nd, 1366, when the King of Navarre issued a certificate of safe conduct for Chaucer, 3 companions, and their servants to enter the country of Spain. This occasion is the first of a number of diplomatic missions to the continent of Europe over the succeeding 10 years. At the age of 25, Chaucer had moved from a household servant, a soldier, to that of a trusted diplomat. So much responsibility and activity in public matters appears to have left Chaucer little time for writing. However, the time traveling did expose Chaucer to the works of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, which was later to have a profound influence upon his own writing. No information exists concerning Chaucer's early education, although doubtlessly he would have been fluent in French, as was the Middle English of the time. He also became competent in Latin and Italian. His writings show that he is closely familiar with many important books of his time. In 1366, Chaucer had married longtime friend Philippa Pan, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen of England, and continued his work for His Majesty as a diplomat. With Chaucer's career prospering and his first important poem, Book of the Duchess, becoming popular, Chaucer continued to connect himself with persons in high places. This first poem was more than 1,300 lines long, probably written in late 1369 or early 1370. It is written for the funeral of Blanche, Duchess of Lancaster, wife of John the Gaunt, who died of plague in September 1369. John of Gaunt was Chaucer's best friend. Lord, but mine heart is maketh light, when I think on that sweetest rite, a commonly one to see, and wish to God it might so he, that she would hold me for her knight, my lady, fair and bright. When Richard II ascended the throne, Chaucer was appointed clerk of the king's work. His pay raise was more than £30 a year and a pitcher of wine daily. He became responsible for construction at Westminster, the Tower of London, and several castles and manors, but times were still hard for Chaucer. It is during the same time that Chaucer was caught up in a legal scandal. The charges were dropped, and Chaucer was found not guilty, but regardless, Chaucer's place in society greatly changed. He resigned, or was removed, it is not clear, but Chaucer left the court and moved to Kent, after which his wife, Philippa, died due to poor health, leaving Chaucer with 2 sons and 2 daughters. Between the years of 1387 and 1400, Chaucer devoted much of his time writing his most famous work, Canterbury Tales. The humor of the work is sometimes very subtle, but is often broad and outspoken when compared to other works written at the same time. Chaucer's original plan for the Canterbury Tales called for 2 tales each from over 20 pilgrims making a journey from Southwark, England, to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket of Canterbury, England. He later modified the plan to write only 1 tale for each pilgrim on the road to Canterbury, but he only finished 24 tales out of the 120 stories it is believed he had been planning. Chaucer introduces each of these pilgrims as vivid, brief sketches, a lively mix of a variety of genres told by the travelers of all aspects of society. The tale survives in groups connected by prologues, or introductions, and epilogues, conclusions, but the proper arrangement of these groups is not altogether clear. At this time in medieval England, literature was separated into very distinct styles, focused more on audience, the lower, middle, and upper classes, than its characters. Chaucer, however, moves freely between all of these styles, showing favoritism to none. He not only considers the reader of his work as his intended audience, but the other pilgrims within the story as well, creating a multi-layer rhetorical puzzle of ambiguities. Chaucer's work thus far surpasses the ability of any single medieval theory to uncover. Chaucer avoids targeting any specific audience or social class of reader, focusing instead on the characters of the story. The characters are written with a skill proportional to their social status and learning. Chaucer draws on his own unique background, knowledge, literary influences, and life experiences. The characters are all divided into 3 distinct classes. The classes begin with those who pray, the clergy, the highest of all of the classes in medieval England. Those who fight, the nobility, and those who work, the commoners and the peasantry. Chaucer also breathes new life into his female characters, giving them for a first time a voice as narrator. Until now, medieval literature only classified women as wives, virgins, or prostitutes. They were never given a primary role in a story. When Henry IV takes the throne, Chaucer hoped to find a new job under a new king. And while Chaucer's reputation for loyalty earned him a small pension, Chaucer went months without pay and was near penniless. Nevertheless, on the strength of his expectations, on the 4th of December, 1399, he released a tenement in the garden of St. Mary's Chapel at Westminster, and it was probably here that he died on the 25th of the following October. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, and his tomb became a nucleus of what is now known as Poets' Corner. It is unclear how he died, and some have even speculated that he may have been murdered. Little is known about this great man's end. Even with such unique and varied life, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales praises the poet as the greatest English poet of all time, and the first to truly show what the language was capable of becoming. His work has influenced all to come after him. The work of Shakespeare, Marlowe, Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Dickens, and even author J.K. Rowling credits Chaucer as a strong influence. A very modest plaque was placed at Geoffrey Chaucer's tomb when he died. However, 150 years later, in 1556, as a testament to his great poetic works, poet Nicholas Birngham constructed a more magnificent tomb in honor of the father and finder of our English language. Today, Chaucer's tomb still stands, and hundreds of visitors pay him homage each day. His works and his unconventional creativity in the 14th century credit him with not only founding the English language, but for capturing the voice of kings and commoners alike.
Okay, so hopefully that gave you a little bit of background on Chaucer, and hopefully you also did not hear my dog going crazy during the middle of the video. At any rate, if you did, my apologies. So why are the Canterbury Tales so special? The first thing is that the Canterbury Tales are an estate satire. We talked about that a little bit before. A satire is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of politics and other topical issues. You know, if you watch something like The Daily Show or Saturday Night Live, they do this all the time, okay? And Chaucer is doing that when he's talking about the three estates. Those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are also special because they include women, like we heard about in the video. The first time that ever happened, that women weren't just as sort of object or marginal characters. They actually are characters with flaws and good sides and different, they actually are round characters instead of flat characters. He also is writing in the vernacular. And the vernacular, if you'll remember again, is that language that's spoken by ordinary people in that particular country. And Chaucer is writing in that ordinary language. Sorry, I got all mixed up. He's writing in that ordinary language. He's considered the greatest poet in English literature because of his great influence on many future writings. And as you heard in the video, everyone from Shakespeare to the Harry Potter lady. Okay, and you might think of Chaucer as the father of our English language. Let me get back on track here. So here are some tips for reading Chaucer. Read aloud. Use a glossary. Our textbook has a great glossary. It also has some ways to understand the vowels. Look at translations. Do try to read the modern. Do try to read the Middle English versions. I know they can be difficult, and you could just say, I'm just going to read the translation. But do take a look at it, because I think you'll be surprised that once you kind of get the pace of it and you read it aloud, that it does become easier. Think of it kind of like text speak. You know how people type things in a text message to each other, and they're kind of like, you have to kind of fill in the blanks to figure out what's going on. If you approach the text in that way, it might help you to understand it a little bit better. Don't get hung up on every single word. Focus on the plot first. Look and see if you can get the general gist of what's happening. Then go back, and when you reread, you'll already know what happened so that you can focus on the themes and maybe try your hand at some of the more difficult words. So let's talk about the Nun's Priest's Tale. So the genre of this tale is a beast fable or an animal fable. And what that is that's a tale that uses animals or beasts, whichever you prefer, to tell a moral. And so it allows the audience to read on two different levels. One is a literal level of what happens with the people, and the other is a moral level of what's happening with the beasts. Okay, so Chaucer also balances some really serious issues in this piece. Some issues against free will and predestination that become some foundational issues as religious shifts happen in England. He talks about pride and flattery and the dangers of those things. He talks about the idea of being content with what you're given in life versus striving for worldly goods. And finally, there is the element of tragedy and death in the Nun's Priest's Tale. And what makes it even the most awesome is that it's all done with chickens. Everybody likes chickens, whether they're on your plate or in your yard. So while you're reading the Nun's Priest's Tale, notice while you're reading, so that you can discuss and reflect on this, the language of courtly love. We will explore this more when we discuss Malory, but that's that very high language in which they explain the chicken fornicating with one another as he plucks her feathers. So using that flowery language to talk about something very dirty. Notice the setting of the garden and how it's a normal garden, but it becomes this kind of love garden, like a love den for the chickens. And then notice the rhetorical arguments and how the Fox and Chanticleer make these very complex arguments to one another about these moral philosophies, and they are merely a chicken and a fox. So hopefully this will help you understand the Nun's Priest's Tale a little bit better in your discussions. Let's talk about the wife of Bath here for a second. So just a little bit of context. Dame Alison of Bath is the wife of Bath, and she is very interesting to scholars because she is the only female traveler that is not under holy orders. So in a way, Alison speaks for women of England in general, in the lower class. Okay, there are some. Alison is a very feisty character. You can tell that by her description. You know, she's wearing this big elaborate hat, and she has a very red face, and Chaucer does this and has Alison speak and challenge the ideas of chivalry, which we'll talk more about in the next lecture on Malory, ideas of marriage, which we've been talking about on the discussion board, and even notions of female sexuality. Alison pushes those boundaries. Quite different from those chicken ladies the priest talks about, huh? So things to think about while you're reading and discussing and reflecting on the wife of Bath. Chaucer reverses the traditional romance. Instead of the queen being quietly admired, in The Wife of Bath's Tale, the queen uses the law herself for vengeance against a rapist. So it's the woman that takes control of sexual violence against another woman. Women control the plot for the first time ever in the English language, in English literature. Um, the central women, the girl that's raped, and the old lady that the knight is punished to live with, are commoners. And the knight's punishment is submission to a woman. Now, there are many things that scholars argue about Chaucer's tone and whether he intended Allison to be such a liberated woman or whether Allison is not a liberated woman but instead is a buffoon character. And those are lots of things that you can chew on with this one. I think it's up to you. What do you think? I'm not going to tell you what to think about it because I think you need to develop your own critical thinking skills. So, but hopefully these will just be some things that you can notice about the reading that you can reflect on while you're reading. So that wraps up our brief introduction to Chaucer, and I look forward to seeing what all you have to say in the discussions about the Canterbury Tales.